Prigozhin announced immediately that his personnel would refuse to do so. We, along no doubt with many members of this House, had been following closely the open escalation of rhetoric from Prigozhin. Last Friday, Prigozhin denounced Russia's military leadership, accusing them of bringing evil on the country and invading Ukraine for their own personal benefit. He drove a coach and horses through President Putin's case for war, saying, and I quote, "The war was needed for Shoigu to receive a hero star. The oligarch clan that rules Russia needed a war." He then went on to add, and I stress I quote him directly here, "The mentally ill scumbags decided it's okay, we'll throw in a few thousand more Russian men as cannon fodder. They'll die under artillery fire, but we'll get what we want." In the early hours of Saturday, Wagner forces entered the city of Rostov-on-Don in southern Russia, and Prigozhin announced that he would march on Moscow. This finally drew a response from Putin, who accused Prigozhin of an armed rebellion and promised tough action and punishment. Wagner troops promptly advanced more than 500 miles northwards towards Moscow before Prigozhin abruptly called off his operation and announced that Wagner would return to their bases. Having condemned him as a traitor in the morning, Putin pardoned Prigozhin in the afternoon, when a Kremlin spokesman announced that no charges would be brought. Mr. Speaker, the government, of course, considers this an internal Russian affair, and of course, the leadership of Russia is a matter exclusively for the Russian people. But everybody should note that one of Putin's protégés had publicly destroyed his case for the war in Ukraine. Prigozhin said on Friday there was nothing out of the ordinary before the 24th of February 2022. The situation was frozen with exchanges of military action and vicious looting by the Russians. He also said that Russia's defense ministry is trying to deceive both the president and the nation, that there was incredible aggression from the Ukrainian side with NATO support ready to attack Russia. The Russian government's lies have been exposed by one of President Putin's own henchmen. Now, the full story of this weekend's events and the long-term effects will take some time to become clear, and it is not helpful to speculate. Prigozhin's rebellion is an unprecedented challenge to President Putin's authority, and it is clear that cracks are emerging in the Russian support for the war. I, of course, hold no candle for Prigozhin or his forces. They have committed atrocities in Ukraine and elsewhere, but he has said out loud what we have believed since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, that this invasion was both unjustified and unprovoked. The events of this weekend are an unprecedented challenge to Putin's authority, with an armoured column approaching his own capital city. As the situation unfolded, the government monitored and responded to developments carefully. I was briefed on Friday evening and again regularly throughout the weekend by my officials. On Saturday, I chaired a COBRA meeting on the situation. We also have been in close contact with our allies. On Saturday, I spoke with Secretary Blinken and my other G7 colleagues, and I've also been in touch with other regional partners. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, spoke with President Biden, President Macron and Chancellor Scholz on Saturday afternoon. Mr. Speaker, despite these internal developments in Russia, Putin's bloody war in Ukraine continues. The Ukrainians fight for their survival, and our Ukrainian friends are mounting a determined counteroffensive and steadily clawing back their territory. We will not be distracted from our work to support Ukraine's self-defence and their subsequent recovery. This weekend's events show that it is Ukraine and its partners, not Russia, that have the strategic patience and resolve to prevail. At last week's Ukraine Recovery Conference, we sent a clear message that not only will we stand by our Ukrainian friends as they resist Putin's onslaught, but we will stand with them in the subsequent peace as well. Now that Russia's leadership cannot justify this war, even to each other, the only rightful course is for Putin to withdraw his troops and end this bloodshed now. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I start by thanking the Foreign Secretary for being in touch over the weekend and for the government for providing briefings on Privy Council terms to Her Majesty's official opposition. Our greatest strength in support of Ukraine and against Putin's invasion is our unity. With this in mind, we are reassured to hear that the government has been working closely with our allies and partners around the world. Can I ask if the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have spoken to their counterparts in Ukraine today or over the weekend to reiterate to Ukraine that all sides of this House are in for the long haul and that the UK will always support them in their fight for democracy over tyranny? The events that unfolded shone a light on serious problems in Russia. Prigozhin has been a long time and close ally of Putin. His military company, the Wagner Group, started becoming involved in eastern Ukraine in 2014. He is not only the owner of Wagner, but also has a media empire that has been involved in hybrid campaigns around the world. It's staggering that Prigozhin publicly challenged not only Putin's leadership, but the false narrative Putin used to justify his full-scale invasion, challenging the lie that Ukraine or NATO posed a threat to Russia, and stating clearly what we all know, that Putin's full-scale invasion is failing on its own terms. It showed that the reality and costs of the war that Putin is trying to suppress are coming back to haunt him. The opposition agrees it's not helpful to speculate about where this will end up in the long term, because this is a puzzle that is constantly shifting in size and shape, but it raises many questions about the here and now. As well as in Ukraine, the Wagner Group has been responsible for atrocities in Syria and right across the continent of Africa. This side of the House has long called for the proscription of a terrorist organisation. We may have seen the end of the Wagner Group in its first iteration, but what does the Foreign Secretary know about where it leaves its future? What was Prigozhin offered that led him to run back just 200 kilometres from Moscow? Will Prigozhin now disappear into obscurity following his denunciation of the lies behind the conduct of Russia's aggression in Ukraine, or could this pose a new threat to Ukraine from Belarus? And will Wagner troops continue to sow the seeds of violence and discord around the world as a private militia or as part of the regular Russian military? The most important effects of this weekend's chaos will be on the bloody conflict on our continent. Mr. Speaker, as Secretary Blinken has said, last February, Russian forces were approaching Kyiv thinking they'd be able to capture the capital in just a few days. 1 year and 4 months on, Russia has had to defend Moscow from the internal rebellion. What happens in Russia is a matter, of course, for Russia. But one thing remains completely certain. The security of our continent depends on Ukraine winning this war. I commend the Foreign Secretary for hosting the Ukraine Recovery Conference in London last week. Following discussions with foreign ministers, is he confident that Ukraine will get the military, economic, diplomatic and humanitarian support it needs in the months ahead? And when are we going to get on with not just freezing, but seizing Russian state assets, as our Opposition Day debate calls for tomorrow? And how does the government plan to use its diplomacy to galvanise support for Ukraine among a wider global coalition of countries that include the global south, many of whom have maintained a neutral stance? We must maintain the depth of support for Ukraine here in the UK, but amongst our allies and partners. We must also grow in its breadth, so that Putin has no choice but to withdraw his troops, so that Ukraine wins, and so that the Ukrainian people get the freedom and justice they deserve.
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman raises a number of very important points, and he asks questions that, of course, we and our allies are asking about what situations may evolve as a direct repercussion of this very public attack on Putin's authority by one of his protégés and closest allies. I'm not comfortable with speculating, but as I'm sure he will understand, analysts within my department and others will look at potential scenarios and ensure that we have mitigations in place if appropriate. And of course, he makes the very important point that Wagner Group are not only operating in Ukraine, but in many other parts of the world, including Syria, including Africa, and we will, of course, look at the potential implications for destabilising impacts in those parts of the world as well. I thank him for the points he's raised about the Ukraine Recovery Conference, and I will put on record the fact that he and the leadership of his party have made clear their enduring support for Ukraine. I know that a number of members from the Shadow Front Bench made themselves available to attend the Ukraine Recovery Conference. Of course, I have been in contact with my interlocutors in Ukraine, predominantly through digital means, through this conflict, through these unfolding events in Russia, and we will, of course, continue to do so. With regard to diplomacy in the global south, I think Prigozhin's words, and as I say, I hold no candle for that man or his organisation, but the mask slipped. He has made it clear that there was no legitimacy for this invasion. There was no genuine, or indeed, there was no risk at all to Russia's territorial integrity from NATO or others. He has made it clear that this war of aggression was driven by the egos of President Putin and the immediate cohort around him. They wanted to recreate an imperial Russia as they had in the past, and the lives of thousands of Ukrainians and others have been lost in pursuit of one man's ego. It is telling that when President Ramaphosa visited Kyiv, President Putin and his military thought it was appropriate to bomb that city whilst he was there. The very, I would say, almost performative rudeness that Putin displayed towards President Ramaphosa and those African leaders prove the lie that Russia is in any way their friends, and they should recognise that what is happening here is an assault on the UN Charter, which keeps those countries safe, and they should now recognise that Vladimir Putin's actions should be denounced.
Liz Truss.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's clear that Putin has been significantly weakened in Russia, and we must not use this time to let up in our support for Ukraine. So first of all, we need to make sure that Ukrainian membership of NATO is fast-tracked at the Vilnius NATO summit. Secondly, we need to make sure there is no talk of deals or concessions or lifting of sanctions on Russia in any circumstances until the war criminals are held to account. And finally, we and our allies, including the Ukrainians, including the Poles, including the Baltic states, need to make sure that we have a plan in the case of the implosion of Russia. Does my right honourable friend agree?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Chairman, my right honourable friend makes incredibly important points. I have said regularly that Ukraine's transformation on the battlefield proves how serious they are about the reform programme that will see them ultimately become a member of NATO, and that action should mean that however long that NATO membership would otherwise have taken, it should of course now be truncated. I've made that point clear, and I know that is a view that's echoed by a number of NATO allies. She is absolutely right that we should recognise that some of the talk about cutting a deal, Ukraine sacrificing some of its sovereign land in the pursuit of what would only be an artificial and perhaps even just temporary peace, is completely inappropriate. Putin will not stop until he has been ejected from Ukraine by the Ukrainian people, and to that end we will continue to support them until they have achieved that end. Ultimately, we do need to make sure that the people responsible for initiating this conflict and facilitating this conflict ultimately pay for the reconstruction. That is why we brought through legislation to make sure assets remain frozen until meaningful and significant reparations have been made to help Ukraine rebuild itself after this conflict.
Drew Henry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Prigozhin's attempted coup failed, but this shows that Putin is in a much weaker position than he was portrayed. He's had to pardon him as he's withdrawn to Belarus, and of course the Russian troops should also now withdraw from Ukraine. But until they do, the SNP sit squarely behind the words of NATO Secretary-General this morning, who said, as Russia continues its assault, it is more important than ever to continue our support for Ukraine. It is also the case that the Wagner group should be proscribed for the crimes that they've committed. However, nothing from Russia can now be taken for granted, as we've seen. Fears that Prigozhin, now in Belarus, with Wagnerite forces, could be used to attack Kyiv are real. So what assessment has the UK government made of this threat, and what coordinated plans are there with allies to bolster Kyiv's defences in such a scenario? Now, I'm pleased that the Secretary of State has convened a COBRA. It has been reported that UK diplomats are preparing for the collapse of Putin's government. How likely does the Secretary of State see this in the short to medium term? And will they be better prepared for this collapsing regime than they were in Afghanistan? Finally, Ukraine has this morning reiterated its support calls for a simplified accession to NATO at the upcoming NATO summit, asking international partners to support this move. Can the Secretary of State put on the record his support for their accession, and can he detail any steps that his government are taking to facilitate this?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, our support for Ukraine in their self-defence is unwavering. They have earned our support, and they have shown that the equipment that we have donated and the training that we have provided has been put to good use, and that is why I have no doubt that ultimately they will endure. With regard to Belarus, we have made it clear since the start of this full-scale invasion that any action by Belarus to get involved in this conflict would be met with severe repercussions from the United Kingdom. Obviously, the sanctions package we have put in place with Russia is in large part also transposed across to Belarus, and we will of course keep a very close watch on the actions that they have taken. With regards to the reports, when I became Foreign Secretary, I ensured that the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office looked at a range of future scenarios, of course, including instability in Russia. We have always made the point, I will repeat it for sake of clarity, the leadership of Russia is for the Russian people. We do not speculate or attempt to predict. What we do is plan and put in place contingency arrangements. And so, therefore, whatever the outcome of this conflict is, we shall be prepared. But I have no doubt that with our international support and in light of the visible lack of discipline on the Russian side, the Ukrainians will prevail, and we will continue working side by side with our international partners in supporting them until they do.
Chairman of the Select Committee, Alicia Kerr.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for his statement and for prior sight of it. What we have learned over the weekend is how deep the rot sits within the Russian military and security services. We have also seen that the social contract between Putin and the people of Russia, whereby they are forced to give up their rights in response for security and stability, is utterly broken. We have also learnt the internal security apparatus is as broken as Putin's offensive military foreign capabilities. But this is not over yet, and there is too much that frankly does not add up. So can my right honourable friend please update us? How many British nationals remain in Russia, and will he now launch a register for British nationals so that we know how many are there should we need to get them out? And secondly, can my right honourable friend please update us on how the Ukrainians have capitalised on this chaos? Because we hear now they may have taken back villages held since 2014 by Russian troops, as well as having crossed the Dnieper River, which would be an enormous turning point because it would allow them to establish that bridgehead to push Russia out of southern Ukraine.
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend makes an incredibly important point. There is a quote, and I will paraphrase it because I don't have the precise words in front of me, but if you trade freedom for security, you end up with neither. I think the Russian people are now recognising that. With regards to what may happen in Russia in the future, as I've said, we of course, look at scenario planning to make sure that we are able to respond to whatever happens. With regard to British nationals within Russia, as she will know, we don't force British nationals to register with the embassy, and so therefore it is not possible for us to give an accurate figure. The UK's travel advice has now for some years made it clear that we advise against all travel to any part of Russia, and we also make it clear that unless your presence in Russia is essential, then you should consider leaving by commercial routes. The House should recognise that because of the situation in Russia, because of the conflict, the ability of the UK to conduct an extraction operation as we did in Sudan would be severely limited, probably to the point of impossibility. So I reiterate our travel advice that British nationals should seek to leave the country, should consider leaving the country by commercial routes unless their presence is absolutely essential. And on her final point, of course, what we have seen in terms of these fractures, these cracks running through the Russian system, will of course had an impact on those Russian troops and those Wagner mercenaries at the front line, who will now be looking over their shoulders just as much as they will be looking forward out of their trenches. We will, of course, continue to support Ukraine in their steady and methodical recapturing of the ground that's been stolen from them by the Russian forces.
Sir Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It was always a phenomenal demonstration of weakness by Putin that he chose to subcontract part of his criminal invasion of Ukraine last year to a bunch of fascists, murderers, rapists and criminals who were mercenaries in the Wagner group. But isn't it now time for us to press home the advantage? Shouldn't we be saying to every British business that has any presence in Russia, get out now, including Unilever and Mantrack and Infosys and all the rest of them? Isn't it time that we seized Russian state assets that are presently sitting in British banks to give them to the reconstruction of Ukraine? And can the Foreign Secretary please explain to me why we have still not handed over the money that was taken from the sale of Abramovich's Chelsea to the charity that has been set up to reconstruct Ukraine?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman sadly displays a lack of knowledge about international law. Governments cannot simply seize the assets of individuals. To do so would be in complete violation of the norms and standards of international law. We have passed legislation making it very clear that frozen assets will remain frozen until significant and appropriate reparations are made by those individuals and entities that have facilitated the conflict. With regard to the Chelsea frozen assets, I refer him to the answer I gave to him when he asked his factually incorrect question at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee.
Order. No, not from the front bench. You don't speak to be heard while sitting down. Tobias Elwood.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Russian leaders have a reputation of eliminating or locking up those that show public dissent. So it is a sign of Putin's weakness that the leader of a full-scale mutiny is offered exile. Would he agree, though, that it's also expectant of any dictator to blame the international community, to blame outside interference for domestic woes? But Putin can't do that this time because he's directly responsible for the Wagner group. That's his creation, his private army, and he's responsible also for the Ukraine war. But would he also agree that Putin may be wounded, Putin's days may be numbered, but he is likely to stoop low in order to stay in power and to justify his invasion of Ukraine?
Secretary of State.
My right honourable friend makes a number of very important points. Prior to this invasion, Vladimir Putin's desire was to limit other countries joining NATO. Because of his attack, we've had direct applications from Sweden and NATO. From Sweden and Finland. Finland has now joined NATO. Sweden well on the way to doing so. His desire was to prevent Ukraine further integrating with Western structures. His invasion has driven Ukraine to that very thing. His invasion was meant to fracture NATO, fracture the transatlantic alliance. It has strengthened it. He created the Wagner Group to bolster his power in Russia, and his creation has undermined his authority. Everything that Vladimir Putin has done has been counterproductive to his own explicit aims. That is why I have no doubt that with our continued support and the support of the international community, Ukraine will prevail, they will win, and they will return their country to its sovereignty.
Valerie Vaz.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I start by wishing the Foreign Secretary and his family well? At the NATO PA in Luxembourg, we unanimously passed a declaration with a clause that specifically recognises the Wagner Group as a criminal and terrorist organisation. Could he ensure that the Prime Minister also supports this at the Vilnius summit?
Secretary of State.
Madam Speaker, the Right Honourable Lady makes an important point about the nature of the Wagner Group. I know there are variations of definitions about how to describe them. The UK sanctions the Wagner Group in its entirety and certain key members of it as well. And we will continue to ensure that we undermine the ability of that mercenary organisation to create conflict, not just in Ukraine but around the world.
James Sunderland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my instinct here is that there's an awful lot more to this than meets the eye, and no doubt as military intelligence and foreign intelligence bears fruit, we'll know more. Given, however, that NATO's imperative has to be to eject Russian forces from Ukraine and not interfere in domestic Russian affairs, can I please ask the Foreign Secretary whether he feels that this now makes a Ukraine victory in Ukraine more or less likely?
My honourable and gallant friend will know how important the moral component is in the success of a military operation. Those Russian troops, those Wagner mercenaries, will now be less confident about the logistic supply to the front line, to the integrity of their military leaders and the strength of their military planning. That will inevitably make them less effective as a fighting force. However, we should recognise that wars are inherently unpredictable. The Ukrainians have always had the stronger morale. Their willingness to endure is legendary. And what we have seen is that Putin's expectation that it would be the West or the Ukrainians that would run out of resolve first has been shown to be a fundamentally flawed hypothesis. And what we are seeing is the cracks emerging within the Russian system rather than in the West.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
I'm very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. The global evil that is the Wagner Group has finally come home to cause problems for the President and the Kremlin. I think the Secretary is absolutely correct to say that we shouldn't speculate on regime change. I don't think that would be helpful. So with that in mind, we should focus on what he can do. The Wagner Group, as has been mentioned a number of times, has been an evil in Syria, in Ukraine, right across the continent of Africa. So can he outline how he intends to, along with other allied countries, formulate a plan to start degrading the Wagner Group's capabilities, its logistics, its finances? And would he also give consideration to the Foreign Office funding the collection of evidence of Wagner war crimes across the world, for which many universities in this country alone would be very well placed to help with?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman makes, I think, an important and valid point. We have worked closely with our international partners in terms of the collection of evidence of war crimes in Ukraine. I think he makes a very good point. I'll need to look at the logistical and practical implications of doing so on a wider scale. But of course, a big part of the Wagner Group's sales pitch to those vulnerable countries who employ them in lieu of having a credible armed force is their idea of invulnerability, their idea of inevitable success. That has been massively undermined by their own actions. We will continue to highlight the inappropriateness of Wagner's activity around the world, including in Africa. We will continue to impose and to impose those sanctions and enforce those sanctions to undermine the evil that that organisation does around the world.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many commentators have pointed out that this weekend's activity may have wounded Putin, and we know that wounded animals can be very dangerous. With this in mind, how concerned is he about reports that Russian forces may have placed mines at the nuclear power plant? Are we facing the potential risk that perhaps as part of a scorched earth policy, we could see a major nuclear incident?
My right honourable friend makes a very important point. I had a meeting with Rafael Grossi, who's the Director General of the IAEA, and we discussed the safety of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, both in terms of being the centre point of a military conflict and also in light of the damage to the dam, the low water levels in the Dnieper used for cooling. I can assure you that we assess all potential credible scenarios and look to mitigate wherever we can.
Dan Jarvis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It was widely reported back in May that the UK government were actively considering prescribing the Wagner Group as a terrorist organisation. Accepting it is early days, can I ask the Foreign Secretary whether an assessment has yet been made as to what the ramifications would be for Putin if he sought to amalgamate the Wagner Group into the Russian conventional armed forces?
I thank the honourable and gallant gentleman for the point he's just made. We do, of course, keep the decisions around prescription of organisations open. It's always a cross-government department, but he will also know we do not typically comment on future prescriptions or designations. We have, of course, looked at the implication back in June when the announcement came out that volunteers were going to be contracted to the Russian Ministry of Defence. We did, of course, look at the implications of the sanction structure and others on that. I'm not at liberty to discuss the outcome of those deliberations, but I can reassure him and the House these are things that we have had under consideration.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many in this House and elsewhere are commenting about the opportunity this provides to the Ukrainian armed forces to press home their advantage while the Russian command chain is in a shambles. But isn't it just a truism that the more help we can deliver to the Ukrainians now, the quicker we can do it, the more likely we will end this war quickly with a favourable outcome? So what are we doing to press home the advantage by galvanising ourselves and our allies to give more support to the Ukrainian armed forces?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right that the situation over the weekend does make the command and control of the Russian forces less effective. I can assure him and the House that we have never been distracted from our primary goal, which is to support the Ukrainians financially and militarily so that they can press home their counter-offensive. And I can assure him and the House that we will continue to do exactly that.
Tamanjeet Singh Dassi.
Thank you very much. Madam Deputy Speaker, media reports over the weekend suggested that President Putin decided to flee Moscow and relocate to St. Petersburg when he learned of Prigozhin's Wagner's advance towards Moscow. This, of course, is in stark contrast to President Zelensky, who bravely remained in Kiev when faced with a full-scale Russian invasion. So what assessment has the Foreign Secretary made of these reports and their veracity?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman makes an incredibly important point about the personal courage that President Zelensky demonstrated at a point in time when Russian tanks were advancing on Kyiv. I've had the pleasure to meet him on a couple of occasions, and it is a genuine privilege to do so. We do, of course, look at a wide range of open source reporting. What I would say to the House is that much of this is speculative, much of this turns out to be inaccurate. We do, of course, attempt to sift as much as we can, but it's very difficult to get a clear picture about the events on the ground. So what we tend to do, as he will understand, is work on a range of potential scenarios and have our planning around the most credible and most likely of those scenarios.
Bob Seeley.
Speaker, the latest news, if it is to be believed, is that 8,000 Wagner mercenaries are going to be joining Yevgeny Prigozhin in Belarus, in a small town called Osipovichy, where some bases, I understand, are being built under dictator Lukashenko's request. Without wishing to speculate whether this brigade-sized force is going to, in the short to medium term, be a greater threat to Lukashenko or to Putin, will he reassure us that their movements, that this base is going to be very closely monitored, given its proximity not only to Russian nuclear weapons, and we've seen the very dual loyalties that Putin, that the Russian army have towards Wagner, but also now their proximity to NATO borders.
My honourable and gallant friend makes an incredibly important point. I'm not at all sure I'd be very comfortable with 8,000 Wagner fighters being my friends anywhere or anytime soon. We have made it absolutely clear to the Belarusian government that we expect them not to be involved in and not to facilitate attacks into Ukraine. We will, of course, keep a very, very close eye on reporting around the locations and activity of those Wagner fighters in Belarus.
Paul Williams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The United Nations Commission on Human Rights says that since the start of the war up to this May, there have been 15,000 civilian casualties. What support is this government giving in situ to these civilian victims of Russia's illegal war?
The honourable gentleman makes an incredibly important point. What we have seen horrifically is the specific targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure by Russian forces in Putin's war of aggression. The UK has, in addition to our military support, also supported the work to rebuild Ukraine and rebuild particularly the energy infrastructure that was so essential during the winter. The Ukraine Recovery Conference, which we hosted in the UK last week, also saw the commitment of 60 billion including a £50 billion promise from the European Union, which was hugely valued for Ukraine's recovery, reconstruction and reform. We will keep working to support the rebuilding of civilian infrastructure. I've witnessed that on my visits to Ukraine, and that will remain part of the UK support to the Ukrainians in their self-defence. Yeah.
Jonathan Janogly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With the increased threat of disintegration of the Russian Federation, does my right honourable friend agree that it will become even more important to monitor and protect Russia's future leaders and influencers, like Free Russia's Vladimir Kara-Murza, already twice poisoned and now sentenced to 25 years in prison for promoting democratic values? And will he look to extending the sanctions on his tormentors from only 5 people to more of the 38 Russian state gangsters whom have been identified so far?
The work that's been done by Vladimir Kara-Murza and others like him who have stood up publicly to criticise the brutality of the Putin regime is admirable. We continue to call upon his immediate release. My right honourable friend is right, of course, that we have sanctioned a number of the individuals who have been involved with his completely inappropriate and unjustified detention. He will know that we don't speculate about future designations, but my department have heard what he said.
Sir Mark Hendrick.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I ask the Foreign Secretary if he and his department have managed to ascertain the rationale behind Prigozhin's move towards Moscow? Was it because Russian forces were shelling the Wagner group in Ukraine? Was he not being paid enough or being paid at all? Was he because he was critical of Shoigu and Gerasimov and the effectiveness of the Russian forces' actions in Ukraine? And indeed, why did he stop short of going as far as he could towards Moscow?
Deputy Speaker, it's hard to know with any certainty about what the trigger event for this armed advance on Moscow would be. Over a number of weeks, we've seen increasingly escalating rhetoric from Prigozhin. He has complained about his troops being starved of supplies. He's complained about ineptitude in the Russian military leadership. He has made all kinds of claims. It's not possible for us to assess which one of those is the trigger point, but of course we have been watching as his comments have become increasingly critical and increasingly intense. I think for me, the main thing that I take away from this is the fact that he makes it absolutely clear that this is a war of aggression, this is a war driven by Vladimir Putin's ego, rather than by any threat to Russia itself. And whilst there's much that we do not know and much that we do not believe, I think that I'm willing to believe that that is very much the case.
Sir James Doddridge.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Wagner Group has a nefarious interest in a whole raft of African countries below the Sahel and across Central Africa. I'm particularly concerned at places like Mali that take direct instructions from the Wagner Group as if they're the Russian government, in places like Niger, where the French get all their uranium from, the DRC, where there's all the critical minerals. In these countries, we've got small but excellent representation. Can I urge the Foreign Secretary to consult with them to see what was happening with the Wagner Group on the ground, and to see if we can fill that vacuum that the Wagner Group leave in a more productive way, both for their economies and ours?
My right honourable friend makes an incredibly important point about the nature of Wagner Group's activities in Africa. I speak with African leaders, those who have Wagner mercenaries in their country or near their borders. I have highlighted the fact that these are not people that can be trusted, and any country whose defence relies upon them, as the Russians have now discovered, any countries who rely upon them for their defence are inherently vulnerable. Of course, I will talk with our representatives in Africa to look at the impact of the Wagner Group's activities and what we can do in close coordination with our international friends and allies to ensure those African countries are safe without the need for mercenary forces.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think many of us can accept the point that the Secretary of State makes about how this is a matter for the Russian people. It's an internal matter in Russia. But of course, it does have a bearing on Ukraine's self-defence. The UK MOD estimates that 60,000 Russians have been killed in the adventure in Ukraine. The BBC and its local partners have verified or confirmed about 25,000, and yet the Russian state is suggesting only 6,000 have been killed. I wonder what his department can do to try to improve the awareness in Russia of the toll that this is taking on conscripts, on soldiers and their families.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable and gallant gentleman makes an incredibly important point that Vladimir Putin has not only been lying to the world about his motivations for this war of aggression, but he's been lying to the Russian people about the implications. Maintaining that lie became increasingly difficult because of the events of this weekend. Of course, our primary sympathy is with the people of Ukraine. It is their country that's being brutalised, their people that are being murdered, their women and children being raped or being stolen. But it's also the case that Russian soldiers, as Prigozhin said in his comments, are being used as cannon fodder by a Russian leader who does not care for them or their families. The more Russians see this, the more they will realise that they are just as much victims of Putin's ego as anyone else in the world. He is absolutely right. The leadership of Russia is exclusively for the Russian people, but I think the Russian people will now see how very badly they have been led.
David Jones.
Deputy Speaker, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has announced today that he is content for the Wagner mercenary group to continue its activities in Africa, notwithstanding Prigozhin's role in the attempted coup over the weekend. Does my right honourable friend agree that that statement simply serves to underline the increasing weakness of the Russian regime? But does he also agree that a leaderless Wagner is potentially even more dangerous and demands the most careful scrutiny by the United Kingdom and its allies?
Madam Deputy Speaker, my right honourable friend makes an incredibly important point. It is not possible for us to predict. I do not intend to speculate, but he's absolutely right. The events over this weekend have made things potentially more dangerous in all the places where Wagner is active and more predictable, which is why we must and we will keep a very close eye on Wagner Group activities, not just in Ukraine, but around the world. And we'll seek to show those leaders who are relying on Wagner that their reliance on that mercenary group is wholly ill-placed.
Derek Twick.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. There's no doubt that the events of this weekend show again why we need to ramp up our support for Ukraine. But my question to the Foreign Secretary is this about intelligence. Is he, because we've heard various scenarios and views about what went on and what the consequences are this weekend, is he concerned that really having trouble getting decent intelligence of what's going on in the Russian leadership and that support group around Putin and those power brokers? And really, what are we doing about that? Because in fact, his answer to my honourable friend and member for Preston sort of underlined that point. So I have a concern that we really are struggling to get any real intelligence of what's going on inside Russia.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman will understand it's a long-standing convention in the House that we do not discuss intelligence matters in the dispatch box.
Well, that's not even true.
Philip Holloman.
What is his estimate of the number of Wagner troops deployed in the Ukrainian theatre, and what's his estimate of the proportion of those who will agree to come under Russian military command on the 1st of July?
My honourable friend asks an important question. The figures are, of course, now massively less predictable than they were just 72 hours ago. We will, of course, keep a very close eye to see which troops might transfer to the Russian Ministry of Defence, which troops might still desire to remain independent, and Russia's reaction to them. This is a continually evolving situation. We will, of course, keep a close eye on it, and we will ensure, however, throughout this, that we remain absolutely committed to supporting Ukraine in their counter-offensive.
Dave Duggan.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the events of this weekend shine a spotlight on the weakness of the Putin regime in Russia. But we knew the weakness was there anyway, because that's the whole reason for invading in the most aggressive and unprovoked manner, to deflect attention from the internal travails within Russia. Nevertheless, though, whatever this weekend's events, Prigozhin is not a catalyst for peace. He is not an advocate for good governance, and he is no friend of anybody in the international rules-based system. So does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that the international community must maintain the utmost vigilance with how this dynamic between Prigozhin and Putin unwinds? And can he advise the House that what will that vigilance look like from a UK perspective?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman makes incredibly important points. The Prigozhin, the Wagner Group, have been responsible, not just in Ukraine but other parts of the world, for truly appalling acts of violence. So he is absolutely right. The fact that Prigozhin turned into an enemy of Putin does not suddenly make him a friend of ours. We remain absolutely clear-eyed about the nature of that individual, the nature of that organisation. And I can assure him, and of course I won't go into detail, but I can assure him we will be keeping a very, very close eye on their activities, not just in the European theatre, but in other parts of the world as well.
Robin Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is wise that we're not drawn into speculation in this chamber about what is happening or has happened in Russia. But it's important that we're not distracted and remain focused on supplying and support for Ukraine in the bloody conflict that they are engaged in as it continues. So can he assure the House then that that military support for Ukraine will continue, and on this practical point, the delivery of military equipment, as requested and agreed here, in particular vital air defence missiles?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I can assure my honourable friend that throughout the high-profile events of this weekend in the UK, and I confirmed this in my phone call with G7 foreign ministers, our friends around the world, remain relentlessly focused on providing the Ukrainians with what they need, where they need it, when they need it, to give themselves the very best chance of a successful counter-offensive this year.
Alison Thewlis. It was apparently reported in the Wall Street Journal that the US is considering delaying further sanctions on the Wagner Group after this weekend's events. Given all that he has said about the danger that the Wagner Group presents worldwide, can he comment any further on where the UK stands on further sanctions against them?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK has sanctioned the Wagner Group in its entirety and members within it. Obviously, it would be inappropriate for me to comment on other countries' sanctions decision, although I would make the point that whilst we regularly do a compare and contrast between government sanctions, our domestic legislations mean the nature of our sanctions do not always match exactly, but both the US and the UK and our friends around the world are relentlessly focused on the evil that's being perpetrated by this organisation, and we will continue to respond robustly.
Simon Fell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend is quite right not to speculate on the implications to the Russian state after the events of the last couple of days, and to focus instead on the illegal invasion of Ukraine. But on that, the rebuilding of the state is also important, and one of the clearest routes to doing so is to use the seized assets of kleptocrats and criminals to help that rebuilding effort. Would my right honourable friend agree?
The UK government's position has been clear. Those people who funded, facilitated, supported this brutal invasion of Ukraine have got to be the people that bear the brunt for its rebuilding. At the Ukraine Recovery Conference last week, a huge number of countries were represented, almost 60 countries represented, companies with a combined net value in the excess of $5 trillion. Were at the organisation, at the event. All of us were committed to make sure we support Ukraine in its recovery. But whilst we may look to de-risk, whilst we may look to pump prime, and whilst we may look to give the first line of support, ultimately the people responsible for this destruction should be the people responsible for rebuilding.
Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I first of all thank the Foreign Secretary very much for his statement and for the encouragement that he gives this House, and more importantly the encouragement that he gives Ukraine, and thank him for that. With the very interesting developments in Russia over the last few days, will the Foreign Secretary outline what steps have been taken to send the message to Putin that whilst Putin's alliances are on a shaky footing, the alliance of those in support of Ukraine has never been more solid and more strong? And does the Foreign Secretary believe now is the time to increase support to Ukraine in terms of arms and aid to underline that very point? Thank you.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we wait for the honourable gentleman from Strangford's contribution, often in debates, because he's always thoughtful and has an unerring ability to hit the nail on the head when it comes to the main thrust of our debates. And he is absolutely right in his assessment that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine believing Ukraine was vulnerable and fragile, that the West were vulnerable and fragile, that somehow we were fickle and that we lacked resolve. And what we have seen in the intervening 15 or 16 months is the Ukrainians standing firm, their alliance of friends getting larger and stronger by the day, and the commitment that we saw at the Ukraine Recovery Conference underlines that. And indeed, it is Russia, it is Putin and the mercenaries that he's contracted to do his brutality that have shown fragility and fracture. And he is absolutely right. Now is the time to enhance our support to Ukraine, to give them not just the encouragement and the political support, but the practical support, the finances and the military support to get the job done. And I can assure him and the House that is exactly what we're going to do.
That's it. Done. You've already called it.
That concludes proceedings on the... So it always concludes proceedings when the honourable member for Strangford asks the last question. Concludes proceedings on the Foreign Secretary's statement. Thank you very much. I will pause for a moment to allow the change in personnel. And before we come to the next statement, I am required to put on record Mr. Speaker's disappointment that an important policy has not been announced first to this House. Not only have ministers been on the airwaves trailing the policy on lung cancer, but a detailed press notice appeared on the department's website well before the start of this statement. Mr. Speaker has repeatedly made it clear that such announcements should be made first to this House, and that to do otherwise is discourteous to this House, and this practice must not continue.
Hear, hear.
Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Steve Barclay.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And first, may I address those remarks on behalf of Mr. Speaker. Of course, any disappointment expressed by Mr. Speaker is a matter of concern. No discourtesy was, of course, wished on the part of the government. It may be helpful just to clarify that no change of policy is being announced in this statement. It is an expansion of an existing policy, which I hope the House will regard as good news. But of course, we very much take on board any concerns that Mr. Speaker has expressed. Madam Deputy Speaker, with permission, I would like to make a statement on our national lung cancer screening programme for England. Around a quarter of patients who develop lung cancer are non-smokers. And we all remember our much-missed friend and colleague, the former member for Old Bexley and Sidcup,